I've sort of been pushed to make this recording slightly faster than I had, let's say, than would have naturally occurred because a question came up, which is actually a very useful question to me, uh, because it helps concretize some of the things that I was already planning to make a recording about. The question is, why isn't South Africa a member of NATO? That's the question. Um, Now, there are sort of superficial reasons why we're not a member of NATO, but those superficial reasons need to be boiled down into their thematic, sort of subcomponents. And NATO itself, I think, has generally lost its character. It's all, at least on its fringes, it's lost its defining structure as well, and it's lost it in the most crucial aspects of what used to characterize it. Um, Now, I'm not an expert in European or NATO history. Even I, um, uh, so let me just couch and put that asterisk on what I'm about to say, because I'm sure that some of the details that I'm going to say are probably going to be egregiously inaccurate. But I think in aggregate, I think that my analysis will hold true. So if you'll sort of forgive the minor details if I get the history wrong, but essentially NATO emerges as a kind of Cold War um, alliance against Russia, and in the modern era, it is a something like it should serve as something like a hedge against what is called the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, um, which is the pact that Russia has with China. And so, even countries that are not in NATO um, are, for geopolitical purposes, regarded as being part of NATO. Many neutral European countries that have not joined NATO, if they were aggressed upon, they would apply to join NATO and they would be accepted immediately, and that is essentially the de facto policy on the ground. So that is the function of NATO. It is a hedge against non-liberal democratic countries. It's a hedge against if I might be so bold as to characterize it like this, uh, mafia driven and ruled states. Because you almost cannot deny that both China and Russia rule uh, from a kind of plutocratic or oligarchical model that is veneered or disguised in a kind of identitarian lowest common denominator narrative of that they're doing it for their people, they're doing it for the some kind of nationalist identitarianism is the concealer for what is essentially a kind of oligarchical structure. And these contradictions are more obvious in Russia, and they are becoming more obvious in China now that China has moved into a more middle income sort of bracket. And you can see this tension, uh, uh, and I know that this is a sloppy way to put it, but within at least within the internal politics of China, in terms of how it is trying to spread its hegemony into Taiwan. And the video that I was going to create on this topic was when China, if China, perhaps I shouldn't be so defeatist, if China succeeds in absorbing Taiwan and crushing the experience of liberty, the liberal experience of democracy in Taiwan, if it can do that, I think that that will be essentially the uh, that will be the watershed of geopolitics in the world moving into a new epoch where the ideological predominance of liberal democracy will clearly be seen as waning. Waning is the one that means that it gets smaller, right? Is the one that means it's diminishing. So liberal democracy will be on the decline, and essentially the moral fortitude of liberal democracy will have essentially, in a very definitive way, in a very clear, telegraphed way, would have been subordinated to the identitarian, oligarchical model of unaccountable leadership. And it will be a dark day, and it will, and it will also mark a watershed moment in the culture war in some sense, because this will be a reflection of how strong every local in Western countries, how the local identitarians have been able to corrosively erode the fabric of liberal democracy and the basic morality that is the foundation of liberal democracy, because they would have transplanted all moral consideration from universal standards and principles into that you must be accorded rights and liberties and dispensations according to your group designation, and the categorical sort of the canonical prestige and pride that someone has in their group must have a kind of equilibrium with other groups, that there must be a parity in outcome and all these sorts of things. So we would have divested the individual rights and liberties. The individual will no longer be the holder of rights and liberties and the source of moral consideration. It will be the group that is given moral consideration, which is what facilitates this kind of murky politics, because then if you have problems, you can never actually translate them into political arguments that then can be rectified using open liberal discourse and liberal democracy, because although we might still have the framework of liberal democracy, the culture, the media, the news media, and the actual discourse itself would have already fundamentally changed into what I would call a proto-fascistic, identitarian-minded way of calculating things. And so the leader can treat you like collateral damage in their grand scheme, in their grand program. They get to redefine, essentially, they have to maximize these targets, and these targets have to do with bestowing pride and bestowing integrity onto the group. And so just because it actually hurts some people and it elevates some other people in a way that is fundamentally egregiously dehumanizing and is fundamentally procedurally is against the rule of law, that you no longer have law that everyone has equal benefit and protection under the law, which is what we have in South Africa. The rule of law has been corroded as non-racialism has been redefined. And that's what happens when you have identitarian values, is that all your other principles and values just become superficial window dressing. It's lip service. It's just hollow. It's a useful disguise for unaccountable politics, essentially. And there's an endemic democratic illiteracy as you displace it with a kind of identitarian jingoism, essentially, which is what we suffer from, especially in South Africa, which is why we can't diagnose any of our problems. Now, my view is that the only thing that's going to stop Russia and China from taking more liberties, and not everything that Russia and China does on the geopolitical stage is bad or toxic or bad-minded or wrong. But in terms of the critique of the internal politics, which obviously their whole ideology has an insulation against, they don't want to be criticized for their internal politics. Russia has actually taken, I would say, a more fair-minded approach. They've said, if you want to help us have a better democracy, if you want to help us, please be constructive in your criticism. Don't just be, don't just be, sorry, I can't think of the word. Don't just be mean about it. Essentially. So, and it's interesting that there's always been a kind of very pragmatic thread in Russian political analysis. Um, and so I do think that it is possible to develop certain structures in Russia that might systematically work towards revamping the oligarchical issues. The problem is that these oligarchs are also playing chess, and they will perhaps anticipate that this is going to encroach on their territory, as it were. And so you get what you see in Russia, which is a kind of news media which tends towards this lowest common denominator. I mean, Russians of late, although, I mean, you could argue everyone in the world has gotten poorer since COVID, but also even before COVID, everyone has gotten poorer, but also the Russians have had to deal with sanctions, but which they've coped with not too badly. But essentially, Russians have been fed a diet of nationalism in substitute for actual development and growth. And that's a trend we're going to also see in China, because they are going to hamper themselves under the weight of their ruling structure, which really hampers entrepreneurs in China. I mean, you just see how oh word, this is so embarrassing when I forget people's names. But the creator of Alibaba, who that tech entrepreneur, he is on a very short leash, and in some sense, I feel like he can never say the obvious, and perhaps he doesn't even think the obvious because he wouldn't even want to place his perspective and his interpretation in that dangerous realm of just acknowledging that China, the government of China, makes it a fundamentally dishonest place. You can't speak. You can't even have discourse, and they will argue that it's the people themselves that wouldn't permit an honest discourse. That if you spoke out against the government, the people themselves would think this is anarchy, and there's not. I would call that an untruth, because yeah, I mean, after you've cultivated and mind controlled for so long, and created, let's say, pillars of the Chinese glass heart, that the state has co-opted. Anyway, so sorry, this is getting a bit esoteric and psychological, but I mean, you can see the same kind of psychological phenomena in Russia. It's the same, and you could imagine it liberalizing just the same. And in fact, the more Russia at least has the framework of democracy to some degree, and you can see how that even opens the door to a liberal frame of reference of these things. Anyway, the point is that there are lots of reasons why countries don't have, let's say, authentic democratic politics. I mean, America itself could be seen to be kind of structurally. I mean, all the structural safeguards for democracy in America could also be seen as being subverted. But at least the culture has the pretense of it, although the identity politics people have sorry, this is a complicated point that I'm raising here. What I'm saying is that even the pretense of a liberal democracy is a valuable thing, even if it doesn't even if your democracy has been corrupted by vested interests, even having the framework of it and the culture of it is something valuable. And usually it translates into, if not perfectly representative democracy, it translates into justice that can be extracted from the courts, for instance. That's where an ethos of liberal democracy gets you. Is it gets you, if not access to um, perfect elections, which might also be an impossible target, it gives you access to justice. Um, but because essentially of the political deficits and the democratic deficits, these people have used that as an excuse to develop a very convoluted theory that, in some sense, to me, is a kind of democratic illiteracy, but that also undermines that common sense of freedom and justice and displaces it with so-called social justice. Um, and that form of social justice exacerbates and prompts and enforces within politics actually that we actually demand to have a leader that destroys democratic literacy and destroys liberal democracy. We actually want rules imposed that break the justice of a liberal democracy, if I can put it like that in an overarching sort of way. So how I see the future going forward, and this is very problematic and finicky and hard, because people actually have to understand the danger of this kind of identitarian morality and structure of politics, because it is a corruption. It is corruption incarnate. And this is why you see that the Democratic Party in America is so corrupt, because they give direct credence to the identitarian wokish, kind of movement. And this makes them overtly authoritarian. You can always see that there's a correlation in this. And that really has to do with morals at the end of the day, and morality. So when you've got this war happening inside the American political system itself, it's going to be hard to do what I'm about to propose. But the only thing that's going to protect Taiwan, as far as I can see, although America supposedly is still doing that to some degree, um, even though Joe Biden, you can see what happened in Afghanistan recently. Joe Biden has given up the moral high ground, so much so that people know that if he threatened to respond to the Taliban for taking Kabul, um, that that he wouldn't even make that threat, and if he did, it wouldn't be believed or something like that. Whereas Trump could make that threat and he could make it credible, and the Taliban never would have taken Kabul, and the evacuation would have been fine. Just to kind of illustrate this. Now, it's not clear if Joe Biden has the same latitude to give up Taiwan to China, which I think he otherwise would. It's actually only the Trump State Department that committed America to essentially protecting Taiwan in its policy, and Joe Biden doesn't have the temerity to change the official policy of the State Department, because that would be, if he tried to change that, it would look like he was kowtowing to China. Um, so that's where we are. Um, that's the thin line that Taiwanese protection has at the moment. Now, the only thing that's going to protect Taiwan in the long term as I can see, if there was something like a revamped NATO, if there was something like a new NATO, a NATO that would not include Turkey. Actually, I don't even know if Turkey is still in it or if it was thrown out, but I know that there was some contention. You see, my current history is not up to date. I don't. I track the themes and the ideas. I don't track the details of politics, sadly. But Turkey, I don't know if Turkey joined. Turkey was very close to joining NATO. I think it did join. It might have been kicked out. It might have been suspended. I can't remember. But Turkey should have never been included in NATO. It's not. It's not a liberal democracy. Erdogan. Sorry, my pronunciation of all these names are probably also very bad. But is it? Yeah. So we have to create an alliance that is centered around a liberal democratic alliance of countries that is morality based. Now, this is not possible in the current structure of the culture war, and it's not going to happen until inside countries people protect their institutions, they protect their universities. They say, we have no identity politics at this university, it's not allowed. Jonathan Haidt tried to develop this sort of ratings agency, which he called the Heterodox Academy, where he tried to say, well, these are universities that don't allow liberal democratic morality. They actually gang up on you and they bully you and they kick you out for believing in democracy and not believing in so-called social justice and identitarian proto-fascist morality. So Jonathan Haidt made a scale of which universities are intolerant of liberal democratic values, essentially. That's what Jonathan Haidt did. I want to do almost the inverse of what Jonathan Haidt did. I want to kick them out of the institution. There's something called the intolerance paradox. You can't be tolerant of intolerance. These people are intolerant of individual rights. They want them to be trampled on. And in the South African context, we have a very clear legal mandate to do this, which is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and non-racialism is a Section 1 value even, and the rights in the Bill of Rights. Based on that, it's quite disgusting that we have an institutionalized corruption of the law currently, because the Constitutional Court has reinterpreted the affirmative action mentions in Section 9 of the equality clauses. And they have actually said that the government has a governmental prerogative to define affirmative action however it so wishes. And we can't use the limitations clause to test to see if that legislation is constitutional or not, because they just have a prerogative, and so we can't legally test it, which is pathetic. It's beyond. I mean, it's just that is an American. That's how the American system is corrupted. We basically imported the American corruption of the legal system right there to let government do whatever it wants without proper judicial oversight. But not only is this fundamentally wrong in law, it has morally corrupted the law, because what this de facto does is it means that the government gets to redefine what non-racialism means, essentially. That's the de facto, and they have done so, because now if you talk out against affirmative action in terms of how it's been implemented, in terms of black economic empowerment, how it facilitates state patronage, then they can call you a racist. When they are the racialists, because racist should have never been, we should never use the word racist. It's a stupid word. The only meaningful moral word to do with race is racialist. Are you a racialist or are you not a racist? Or are you not a racialist? That's the only thing that's important. If you are a racialist, that is what to be a racist is. Why use the proper name of the phenomena? Yeah, we should stop talking about racism. We should talk about racialism. That's what we should have That's the language of the Constitution as well. The Constitution doesn't say the word racism once. It says racialism, or it's anyway. This has helped them construct their feeble rationalizations for what they do and how they've institutionally corrupted the law with this now moral corruption. Okay, where was I? So the point is here. Sorry, I just need to find my thread now. So now they can play semantic word games. They can play semantic shell games. And they can even say that if you speak out against affirmative action, if you argue against that it's a bad policy, then you are being a racist, and that you can be brought up for hate speech, and that you're trying to deny other people their equality. And then they can even make a circuitous argument that you are infringing the Bill of Rights for not supporting their disgusting failure of an affirmative action policy. So they've actually they're trying to turn the Constitution into a weapon against liberal democratic discourse and normal politics. They're trying to diminish political speech, essentially. So this is what happens when you've got an institutionalized, morally corrupt law, is that it starts to poison everything. And they can even perhaps say that, oh, well, now in fact, now the academy, the universities in South Africa have to promote anti-racism and this version of black economic empowerment, because if they don't, they are sowing the seeds of inequality. That's how this groupthink, that's how this mob mentality, and proto-fascism, this is how it spreads its tendrils, how it reaches out with its octopus arms and takes a hold of everything. It's this loose chain of fudged associative logic and thinking and rationalization. Okay, so I say we take the opposite view, and we say, well, either we have to create a new institution, we have to create a new university, or we have to get these people thrown out of the institution, out of the academy. And we say that, no, you're being unconstitutional, and that's why we're throwing you out. You've created constitutional damages, and even if the Constitutional Court does not endorse that, we have a problem with justice and morality in this country. I've made YouTube recordings specifically about this. We need to impeach these judges that created this institutionalized corruption of the law. Or we need to establish a new constitutional court from some kind of quorum of judges, and we need a different selection. We need a different mode of selecting constitutional court judges, because these political appointments that we can now even know were handpicked in the Cadre Deployment Committee. They handpicked the constitutional judges, and that's why we sit, I guess, with an institutionally corrupt law now, where the Constitution is turned on its head, as even the Constitution itself is being scapegoated as the thing holding us back from transformation, when it is the thing that would have diagnosed what ails us, because it is this moral corruption in the law that facilitates the state patronage and the overt corruption. Okay. So my point is that these issues exist in various different pockets. They exist in the culture war. They can also exist in the law itself. In South Africa, it's problematic because South Africa has the best constitution in the world, and so it's been hoodwinked. It's been distorted. It's been twisted. And if we don't untwist it, we're going to be fucked. And we need to unfuck the Constitution. And that's not an easy thing to do, essentially. So that's a problem. In America, you could just say that it's a culture war. There's nothing stopping them from setting up universities, new universities, and saying, uh, if you're woke, we have a filtration system. You don't get employed here. We will criticize woke people, but we won't. We're not going to promulgate your disgusting views because they're against the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution. They're unconstitutional, uh, etc., etc. They have the latitude to do that. Whereas in South Africa, we have this creeping effect where they're actually going to use this twisted version of the Constitution to enforce their dogma and their so-called anti-racism and so-called social justice, which you can see this, how they've already spread in all these different institutions, like the Human Rights Commission is infused with this toxic morality. It is so disgusting to see the Human Rights Commission produce this proto-fascist rhetoric that disguises and supports the ANC, because the only thing holding the ANC together is really this kind of ethno-nationalistic glue of retributivism, of revenge against the scapegoat, the ideological scapegoat, because it's capitalism that's destroying us. It's not the government policy that's failing us. So we don't have debate over the policy. We don't have democratic literacy. Instead, we just have scapegoating. We just have the Jewish conspiracy, which is the same as the conspiracy of white male privilege. You know, it's the same thing with just different targets. It's the same thing that the Nazis did. Okay, so anyway, what I'm saying is that it's hard to get a handle on. It's hard but the general solution is that you have to create your own spaces. You have to segregate your own spaces. You have to say, this space is for people that are not woke. If you're woke, you're not welcome here. Leave us alone. We are going to have real culture that's authentic and genuine. We're going to treat each other as individuals. You're not invited. Until you do that, because you can't reason with these people unless they're at the point that they're willing to try to live a different way, and they're going to try to change their behavior and conform to a culture that isn't premised in their superficial moral structure, where they get to fudge and rationalize and have motivated reasoning and project grievance onto other people and all these sorts of things, where they don't even have their own moral integrity anymore, because they can just systematize blame and accountability at will. They can just always systematize the problem. And it's never a particular issue, or the particular issue is always a group generalization about some attribute, but it's just not actionable. It's always just addressing the ether and then having a scapegoat that represents the system to sacrifice to their social justice, dark God. So that model, you can't try to incorporate it. You have to exclude it. So you say, no, we don't agree with your values. We find you immoral. We find you to be evil, morally evil people. Look, you might say that you're doing this for the best intentions. I don't actually think that they have that good intentions. They can tell that story, but psychologically, I think it's premised in a kind of bad faith. Although there are some of them who you could argue are unconscious of this bad faith, but I don't think you operate this way very long without very quickly realizing that you're operating a kind of mechanical, circular reasoning, and that it is a kind of self-satisfying, self-referential, way of insulating yourself from criticism. It's a kind of dishonest way of you can see this, how they disrupt other people's talking and things like that, how they basically, they create these cry bully mobs where they have one person crying and everybody else is the bully support. It's like the whole thing is it's a morality play. It's confected, it's manufactured. It serves the general formula of the narrative, and they are a slave to that formula. And the idea is that, well, that formula is capable of piercing you, of psychologically penetrating you, and you must be supplicant to it. You must be sympathy. You must deliver sympathy to it. And it's that kind of intellectual sympathy that if you give intellectual sympathy to it, you're poisoned, you're part of it. You've just been bitten by the beast, and now you're going to have 6 months of excruciating, agonizing. This is a bit of an analogy and a metaphor, but you're going to go through a kind of morphology of moral incubation, because this thing is a poison, and it's going to poison your own psychology if you. So my view is segregation. My view is that you cut these people out of institutions. It's not enough to do it on an individual scale. You have to do it on an institutional level, because then you can actually have functioning liberal democratic value places. And if we don't start doing that, we're going to boil to death. Democracy is going to boil up into nothing. And after we do that, we need to perhaps create a geopolitical alliance of liberal democratic allies. And that will be able to save Taiwan. That will be able to protect. That's the only thing that's going to stand up against Russia and China, because they are living in a pragmatic world. They're living in a realism. We're not living in that realism yet, because we're too bogged down by this divisive internal attrition. Because this is a diversion. I mean, while we are arguing about identity politics, the ANC has stolen how much money? While we were arguing about identity politics, how much state patronage has continued to flow? This is what identity politics gets you. This is what the rhetoric of social justice gets you. It's a fucking smokescreen for autocracy, for oligarchy. It lets the oligarchs run amok, which is essentially the model of China and Russia. So we are fighting China and Russia as an analogy, metaphorically. We are fighting their model of rule in our own countries. And if we don't start getting to grips with that, we are going to, divided, we're going to fall. We're going to be picked off eventually. And we can see this in the waning of American power. Now, that would be my model for a new model of NATO. And this new model has very high standards that I think most countries, look, maybe I shouldn't be so defeatist and cynical and pessimistic, but a lot of people are quite far from this still. They're quite far from seeing it like I've just laid it out. Continental European countries are, in terms of their political consciousness, are, in my view, very toxic. Continental European countries are terrible places for consciousness, for political consciousness and for morality, because they have what I call the Napoleonic corruption. They've never had a liberal democratic constitution. They have maybe some of their frameworks, but they've never had liberal democratic politics, really. They have a kind of quaint approximation. They have a kind of quaint simulacra of the American Constitution that was kind of, that they implanted after the Second World War. They've always lived on a kind of national identity, which is, look, national identities are somewhat organic. They will somewhat occur naturally, and they will mostly, they're accurate in how they correspond with culture. Well, if you have a common culture, then you can say, and if your national identity has that. But I'm saying that they had a national identity in their political consciousness and in their it's not funded. It's not founded in values and principles and rights. And um, obviously Europe is a huge place, so I can't generalize too much, but I would argue that these are places that are taught more history than they're taught civics, in terms of civics of the actual structure of the state. So these are places that have a living contradiction, because what's his name is even a perfect example of this. The guy who killed 22, he dressed up, he made his own commando suit that made him look like a police officer or something like that, and he shot all these people who were like social justice people as well. And I think he also made fertilizer bombs as well. Brev, no, sorry, I can't remember his name. I think, oh my word, I can't remember the country. I think it's Sweden. And I imagine that the reason, because I mean, he had a manifesto. He didn't kill himself. He had a long manifesto, and he has a moral argument for what he did. And I mean, I haven't read his manifesto, but I'll just say that I can say that the source of that, I'm somewhat projecting this because I haven't read it, but I believe probably that the source of that manifesto is that he was not given a course in civics. He was not told, this is you as an individual citizen of the state. Every individual citizen has the right to their own freedom of consciousness, has the right to the freedom of speech. Instead, he wasn't taught all these things in a way that actually was coherent. Instead, he was told history about the dynasty of his country, about the king and the monarch of the country, and how you can't commit treason, that treason is a crime in this country. And so he probably said, well, these people, they are treasonous to their national identity, and they are believing in this kind of this, that they have given their allegiance to a foreign power, because it wasn't the liberal democratic structure was not presented to him for him to know what the limits and the justice, how justice was defined. And so he had his version of justice, which was so at odds with these other people's so-called social justice. And who ideologically primed this showdown? Because this is someone who, I mean, again, I'm projecting this. I haven't read his manifesto, but and probably if you read the manifesto, what I'm saying is going to be the subtext and theme of or it's going to be an explanatory of it. So it's probably not going to be directly in because I mean, I'm criticizing both in some sense. I'm criticizing the country's education system, and I'm criticizing him for not understanding that the fact is that the structure of most continental European countries, including probably his one, is just that it's window dressing, it's a story, it's a narrative, and it's a hodgepodge narrative. It's not coherent even. It's not even coherent. Now, how can you have a defense of a liberal democratic order? How can you defend a liberal democratic order if it's just fudge, if it's just sludge there to be projected on, like the identitarians project onto it? You can't defend sludge. You have to defend a justice system that is like the South African system, that is like the South African constitution, although we've done a piss poor job of it being not institutionally corrupted. It has not been defended by the judges. The judges have murdered the South African constitution. The question is, can it be resurrected? Which is an open question. But anyway, so yeah, I'm going into all these. So this is okay. So that's the answer to the question. Why isn't South Africa a part of NATO? Well, let me just give the superficial reason. The superficial reason why we're not part of NATO is because it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And we're not a country in the North Atlantic. And the reason why that geographical designation exists is because, again, it is geared towards China and Russia. And in some sense, if we were to involve ourselves in NATO, it would perhaps hamper some of our trading relations with China and Russia, which we have to watch out, because China is very sensitive. If you criticize China, they will stop trading with you. They will tank your economy. They will disrupt things for you. They use their economic might very coercively. They don't have a kind of they don't separate politics and trade, but in some sense, a lot of countries don't do that. But you could say that China does it for softer reasons, or they don't. Oh, it's not softer reasons. They do it. They do it based on, because they essentially don't believe in freedom of speech. They essentially don't believe, they don't have the same values. So their values are continuity of their oligarchical model of governance. So they have different interests, and those interests are not in alignment with their citizens. And they're also based on infantilizing their citizens and feeding them this lowest common denominator narrative that makes them prone to conforming to the rule of those countries. And we are developing that kind of rule in South Africa by the ANC. The ANC is ruling us as the so-called ruling party when it's really just the governing party, and it does not deserve to govern. But that's where you get with identity politics. Then you start getting a ruling party because they must rule and take ownership of the identity equilibrium, and they must mediate between the identities, and they must redistribute between the identities, and they must perform this kind of interventionist function that breaks liberal democratic freedoms and an open liberal society, and cracks down on it in order to impose so-called social justice, while they actually destroy real social justice, because authentic social justice is justice for the individual against the group, not for group against group, or members of a group against members of another group. I mean, it's utterly backwards. I mean, it's literally the person who coined the term social justice was Orwell. And for Orwell to know that his term, which is also used in the South African Constitution, has been contorted, has been used in an Orwellian way, in the sense that it has been used as a doublespeak. Sorry, I'm sounding ignorant because I'm saying these things, and I don't know what. But when people say Orwellian, they mean that, you know, the word has been redefined semantically. I'm not sure. I keep on reminding myself what doublespeak and newspeak are, but I always forget. But anyway, let me end this recording on that embarrassing note. But to me, in the future, it is a necessity that NATO essentially evolves and it ups its game. But the countries aren't ready yet. The culture war isn't ready yet. Because the geopolitical formation can only happen once a more defined stand has been taken against, let's say, China and Russia, the version of China and Russian ideology which exists inside of each country, which is the identitarian wokeness. And let me just add one more point, which reinforces another point that I made about, I believe his surname was Breivik. And was it Anders Breivik? Anyway, the guy who shot all those people. Talking about how he was somewhat probably duped by his historical education in his country, and how at odds it was to the current political climate, as it were, that these things were not coherently homogenized. But let me just say that this is why, when the identitarians attack national identity, I always say, do not defend national identity as your first port of call. You're playing into their trap. if they attack you for being patriotic, don't defend the flag. Defend why you are patriotic. Don't defend patriotism. And obviously, because they're only attacking civic nationalism and civic identity because it is an alternative that displaces identity politics and racial and sexist identity. So the way to fight back against it is don't take the bait. Don't defend America or the American flag or whatever it might be. I mean, this is also why they want. This is why they want. This is why they want sportsmen to take the knee, because they're supplicating the national identity to the racial identity, essentially, and the racial categorization. They don't want the unity of the civic nationalism. They're trying to divide that. And so the reason why I say don't defend it is because then you're playing on their turf. So it's you defend it at the end of your argument. So you have to make the general principle first. You make the general claim first, and then you say, well, that's why I support this civic nationalism. So you say, well, we need civic nationalism to have an open democratic society, because if people don't have the independent moral integrity of existing as individuals instead of as groups, then they can't engage in the democratic discourse. They can't engage in political debate and discourse, because they're not looking at politics. They're looking at an they're looking through an ideological worldview. They can't even have a political debate anymore, because they can use this generalization to derive whatever they want, lies, and statistics. They can trot out any number of things that are cherry picked that confirm the narrative, and then it's just a circular thing. But the reason why I say don't defend civic, don't defend your patriotism. First defend civic nationalism in principle, and then say, well, that's why I defend it, is a better way of doing it. But because if you're fighting against your rah, I'm American, and they are saying rah, I'm black, or I'm a woman, or something like that, or I'm transgender, or I'm LGBT, whatever all those things are. If they are doing that, you're amplifying, you are feeding them energy, which is also why I believe that we should just have segregation away from them. But you also need a kind of filtration system that keeps them out, because otherwise you can incubate your own toxic identitarianism potentially, that's not based in values and morality. But basically the distinction is that they don't have real morality. They have got generalizations and stories and narratives that they cast these webs onto people, these narrative webs, and you get stuck in that web, and there you will be trapped forever, running their formula and serving their formula, but being parasitically fed on. But so I've perhaps illustrated it, but I just want to make the point explicit that if you try to fight their black pride with American pride, it somewhat fails to refute their fundamental point, and in some sense it amplifies their game that they're playing. You don't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water. That's my point. And until we start bringing in the water into a way to segregate ourselves from these people and exclude them, you are really just playing a dangerous game where you're going to end up the same as them, is my point. Because why do you care about your patriotism? Because it stands for values and morality and freedom and individual integrity and you know um, this is it's an interesting note in history. Justice Scalia, who thematically this is on this point, who upheld the right of an individual to burn his own, as long as he owned the American flag, it was owned by him. He could burn his own flag in protest, and it could not be made illegal, could not be made a crime for him to burn his own flag in protest. He was given a lot of heat. He was given a lot of criticism for this judgment. And one of the presidents, Bush Sr., actually, I think, gave his wife a Christmas card because he couldn't give Justice Scalia a card directly saying, you've been through a lot and it's terrible, and there's a lot of heat right now, and you just want to say, he made the right decision, and all our, you know, um, condolences going through this hard time, kind of was the tone of the note. And it's interesting. So Bush Senior could know this on some fundamental level of basic reasoning and coherence, but he probably couldn't say that out loud. It would have been political suicide. But sadly, this is the kind of water that is needed in order to actually have a legitimate, functioning, high integrity, liberal democratic ethos and culture. And sadly, the culture war, or at least these very, these people, these identitarians, these are like the old imperials. These are like the regents of the of the imperial realm in every empire. They are just thirsty for executive legal positivism and control over society, and a kind of regulation that gets to dictate what culture, the content of culture, according to its moral judgment. And it doesn't matter the individual rights that it treads on. And I'll argue as well that the American system has a lot of positive charm to it. The problem is that the rights in the Bill of Rights are fundamentally, they're essentially void for vagueness, but that they, in the American Constitution, because they don't have a limitations clause, and therefore you don't have available ways to argue against their limitation when they are being infringed, and arguing if to what extent the infringement is justifiable or not. You're actually, in the South African Constitution, you're actually given ample means and levers to make the case, so that if you can make a strong enough pragmatic case that there's another way that you could have not infringed the right, and would have been relatively not that differently expensive or whatever, then there's certainly no excuse to infringe the right. So you're given so many pragmatic opportunities to show that the infringement should just not be done, that then you are really protected, in a structural way. Anyway, so I'm just trying to say that there. So a lot of this gets very esoteric, but the American system really is dependent on the democratic functioning, on the democracy itself. The democracy ends up defining what justice means in such an extreme way that even encroaches on the so-called constitutional guarantees that Anyway, this is a separate point entirely. Let me stop this recording. I'm waffling on forever, and this is not relevant. But this is the difference between having a society, I think, that is capable of having real integrity, and to a large extent, America is capable of having integrity, but it requires the majority of the people to kind of be astute enough to be guided by these fundamental kind of structural principle ways of thinking, and that might be too high a bar, especially in the realm of politics and campaigning and narratives, and low bandwidth in terms of that, the level of discourse in the debate, and the actual politicians themselves that get to devise the law so extensively, and how things can be hidden in regulation, which can then never really be properly vetted against a full set of values and principles, which are not properly. The American Constitution does not have a full set of values and principles. It does not have a large enough independent substantive structure in the law, is the problem, essentially. And I think that this is what leads to the living constitution people in the American system, is because they know that law doesn't function unless you have some kind of living independent jurisprudence. But that living independent jurisprudence must not be living in the sense, it can only be living in a way that is not a mockery of law itself, because in the way that the living constitution people put it, they are really the law of man. It's disgusting. There's no excuse for it. Justice Scalia, I think, is perfectly correct. But the way to solve that is that you have to have enumerated substantive values and maxims, and you have to have a large legal tradition that's larger than merely the common law, that has actual principles and a full set of principles. And in South Africa, we have that from the Roman Dutch, which was a legal system that was designed for aristocrats suing aristocrats. Okay. So what I'm saying is that it's intellectually deep, and I would even argue philosophically exhaustive in terms of all the mechanics. And so you have to have something that is complete in principle, substantively, and then it's living in the sense that you extract from that living tests. You extract legal tests out of the principles, and maybe you come up with a new legal test. But it's the same principles, it's the same values. And then that's how the law becomes independent, but also bounded, so that it is still the rule of law and not the rule of man. And that is essentially what the South African Constitution has, along with its with the other sources of law, the Roman Dutch substantive law and the Constitution.